Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Bill had asked me to do a show on the fire department and the border patrol. Things I had done and seen while trying to not get killed. I put the firefighting show together and ran out of time, so I made another show on my time working for the government. I was going to call it Border Patrol Misadventures, but I'd already done that back in December 2019, so I decided to go with more Border Patrol Misadventures. Well, I did that one in September of 2020, so here we are with Mishaps, which is another way of saying misadventures. Thank goodness for the thesaurus. I am going to call them aliens because it is a legal definition. An alien is anyone not a citizen or national of the United States. We learned this at the academy. I'm not talking about being from outer space. I'm talking about folks not born or naturalized here. Nowadays, political correctness is ruining the country. Movies like Blazing Saddles could never be made today, and it was one of the funniest movies ever made. I'll just call them aliens. Each day I think we're now living the book 1984. I read it years ago and I thought, that'll never happen. And now it's here. Most agents go to Glencoe for their initial training. We got to go to Anniston, Alabama, to Fort McClellan. I almost called it McIntosh. Wrong city. The McClellan 500 was a mess. We stayed in Army barracks and we ate delicious Army food. Yuck. The major advantage of training under such conditions was, once we were done, life could only improve. We had quite a group. One guy we called Fred was a counselor at a substance abuse clinic. He should have been a patient. He had bottles of booze hidden all over the place so that during class he could nip out and have a nip or two or three. On the weekends, he would decide to order pizza late at night after consuming his liquid diet. Fred would stumble out to the phone in his underwear. He'd call the pizza place and order 2 large pizzas, and then he'd pass out waiting for his food. The pizza delivery person would show up looking for him. One of his classmates would grab his wallet and pay for the pizza, along with a very healthy tip. His roommates would gather around and eat everything. Someone would take some pizza sauce and smear it around Fred's mouth and chest, and they would leave all of the empty boxes and crusts laying around him on the floor. The next morning, Fred would wake up thinking he'd eaten everything, but he was still hungry. Instead of eating breakfast, he'd pull a bottle out and steady his nerves for the day. The staff knew what was going on. They waited until he had enough rope, and then he kicked him out. His roommates were all disappointed because now they had to pay for their own pizza. How any of us survived is beyond me. I'm not going to talk about the lady of negotiable affections camped out in the next building over. Something like 40 guys got fired over that incident. Most of them were from the El Paso sector. We had a saying, 71 and a gun. Any kind of a passing score was good, and I did score a 71 on my Spanish final, and I was issued my gun and sent to my station. In Laredo, we had a lot of details, assignments where you worked other things, so if you got bored doing the same thing for too long, you could try something else for a while. My favorite detail was sign cutting. The vehicles were trashed, but we worked out of town. The folks we usually caught were decent people just looking for work. There were some guys I liked to work with. We had things in common and would talk about all kinds of paranormal things going on around the world. There were also a few guys we tried to avoid. People with big egos and personalities that belonged underground. Each year the shifts would get shuffled around, so you had a 33% chance of getting a really good shift, or maybe you'd get the shift from hell. Shift assignments would be posted a couple of months in advance, and everybody would scope it out to see how the following year was going to be. It was common for somebody to take a pencil and put a little check mark next to the names of all of the unsavory people on each shift so you could get a bird's eye view. One year, I noticed I was on the shift from heaven. There were some supervisors who felt it was their duty to micromanage everything we did. Then there were some who did their jobs and they let us do ours. One shift on the new schedule had just about all the check marks. All the people we didn't much care for were somehow all on the same shift. We had lots of names for this one shift. None of them were very nice. I felt sorry for the guys I liked who wound up filling out the list. I was more glad that it wasn't me. The X-Man was considered the #1 soup in the world. He was laid back, easygoing, and he had the best intel available. If X-Man had information, he'd call you aside and just mention there might be something going on in your area. This meant there was going to be a dope load, and there was a 90% chance it would happen. He didn't tell us how to work the area, and he didn't get on the radio and tell us what to do. He allowed us to figure it out. He also knew who to put in certain areas. If the guy was a loser, well, he wasn't going to put him down there where the action was. I always wondered why he was so easy to get along with. One night, X-Man was in the right mood. If you know folks who saw combat, you'll notice the ones who really saw things don't like to talk about it. The ones who do talk usually imagined their feats of glory. Oh yes, we had a few of those as well. I was riding around with X-Man, and he got to talking about his time in the Marine Corps. He was in Vietnam, assigned to a base right up on the northern border. They received enemy fire just about every day, 24 hours a day. X-Man said he was sitting in a foxhole, hoping to survive the shelling going on. He could hear the sound of mortar rounds as they flew overhead, landing all around him. As the rounds went by, he said he could track them as they flew. The sound would go to the left or the right, or maybe right on over his head and land behind him. He heard a round flying that he was hoping would land behind his position. He was holding his helmet with his head down, listening as the sound got louder and louder. The mortar round hit the ground right at his feet. It dug into the ground with just the fins sticking up. X-Man looked at this highly explosive device and thought he had just enough time on Earth to say, well, he did say it, and he closed his eyes. X-Man sat there waiting to die. He figured time was going real slow, like the way they show it in a movie. He sat there not moving and waited. Nothing happened. The mortar was a dud. The thing about duds is they might still go off. He opened one eye and he looked. The thing was still there with just a wisp of smoke coming up from it. His feet were on either side of this deadly thing. It just sat there, like death. X-Man carefully lifted one foot and moved it over to the other side. He then put his hands on the ground and pushed himself up. The round still didn't go off, so X-Man gently stepped away and got out of the foxhole. Still no explosion. From that day on, X-Man saw the world in a different light. If an agent had trouble, say he had to go talk to Sector, X-Man would either go along with him or at least encourage him on what to say or what not to say. He was always there for the agents. He wasn't in it for himself. We had one agent who was on the blacklist. The story of his career difficulties was something out of a sitcom. Way back, this one agent, I'll call him Joe. I gotta call him something. Joe had become a supervisor. Something happened involving a bathroom and a desk, and the chief wanted Joe to find the culprit and deal with him in a very nasty way. Joe said he didn't know for sure who did this nasty deed. The chief threatened Joe with his job. Either he pointed out somebody who was guilty, or Joe was going to be blamed. Well, Joe showed up at Sector with his lawyer to keep from being fired. Unfortunately, the lawyer had been given a ride in a government vehicle, and Joe got busted back to being a line agent. We called it GS9 for life. Keep in mind, this was back when who you knew was how you got promoted. You could be the hardest working agent, but if you didn't hang out with the right people, you were pretty much stuck as a GS9. There were a few folks who managed to slip by and get promoted despite their lack of a brown nose. Joe was also cool. If he liked you, he would teach you a lot. If he thought you were a putz, he would sit on the passenger seat all night or all day and not say a word. Joe had come in 1968 right out of the military. One of his first duties was to move Sector from Fort McIntosh to Delmar, the new building. That sucker was new in 1968, and they're still using it. Joe was about to retire, and it was announced that he wasn't going to have an official retirement party. He was still on the blacklist. We immediately began planning his party. The next announcement was no supervisor was to attend this privately funded retirement party that was not supposed to be had. X-Man had the party at his house. A few other supervisors showed up, only the ones that we liked. 95% of the agents were there. Even those of us who had to work that night found a reason to swing by and check the place out to make sure that no illegal aliens were hanging around. Once there, we did have to grab some food since we needed to eat anyway. It was a lot of food. I managed to get myself on sign cutting shift many times. Once or twice I had to con my way on, but I liked it and I think I was doing a good job as a tracker. I was on the sign cutting shift when the special response team was activated to work traffic. I was moved from sign cutting to work some intel way down south. This was supposed to be a 3-month detail, but right in the middle of it, I got reassigned to work the railroad bridge for 2 weeks. I was officially on 4 different schedules, but I only got paid for one. What kind of ruined the whole month was we had been working some intel down by Dolores Creek. We had found tracks going back and forth from the river, and we figured more than likely it was dope coming over from Mexico. SRT and Special Ops had arranged to work the area both day and night. Just a few guys from both groups to see what was coming over. Halfway through the railroad bridge operation was when we got the bad news. Our information had been passed on to the Zapata station, and they were told to drive over once in a while and check on things. In the middle of the day, they drove up on a 500-pound cocaine shipment coming out of Mexico that was being loaded into a couple of pickups. The smugglers didn't know it was just 2 agents, and they ran back for Mexico. The agents received credit for a huge dope bust. Well, SRT and Special Ops pitched a bit of a fit, and they decided to give us a partial credit. It was our intel. We were working it. Oh well, that's how things happened. Back on sign cutting, and life was good once more. We only had 4 agents, and the boss wanted 7-day coverage. This led to some scheduling problems. Some days there would be 2 of us, and once in a while it would be just one guy out there all by himself. I was out on my own, checking the corners on Wormser Road. Wormser ran out east from town. There were a lot of ranches that had gates on it, and it was usually a good place to find people who were traveling through the countryside. As I was getting close to the end of the road, I saw a bunch of tracks crossing. I jumped into the Alexander Ranch. There was nobody to call, so I just opened the gate and went in to see what I could do. Had to do something. I used to have 4 huge key rings. I could open just about any and every gate in our area, as well as up north and to the east of town. When I retired, I could no longer use them, so I gave them to a friend of mine who is still working. Hope he's getting some use out of them. Well, I crossed the ranch checking for tracks. At the far north side, there weren't any. I drove back to the last place I saw them, and I got out on foot. I never expected to catch the group. I just thought I would spend the day following them and see what happened. I followed the sign into a wooded area, and there they were. There were 16 guys from Mexico all asleep under the trees. I woke them up, and they gathered their things. I walked back to my Tahoe, and they all walked along behind me, like we were one big happy group. Once there, I called for an agent with a van to come help me out. Ron answered the call, but he said he didn't have keys to get into the ranch where I had the group. I had the guys from Mexico pile up all their bags on the side of the road, and then I got them into my vehicle. One was sitting in between the front seats. Two of them were on the passenger seat. I got 5 guys squeezed into the rear seat. I put 4 more in the cargo area. The last 4 men had to stand on the back bumper and hold on to the luggage rack. I carefully drove out to Wormser Road where Ron was waiting. The aliens all got off of my vehicle and into the van, and then Ron followed me back to the ranch so we could get their bags. The folks we met out on the ranches were so much nicer than the people in town. On another occasion, me and BT were working on the San Antonio ranch when we spotted a bunch of sign crossing into an area that didn't have any gates going into it. We left the Bronco and we started to walk, following the sign as it wove back and forth, trying to stay out of the worst of the brush. Following people through the brush is more of an art form. You have to read the trail to figure out what these people might do. We walked for a few miles when we encountered what was called a Keystone maneuver. If you ever saw the Keystone Cops, you'll know what the name implies. The aliens were all walking along in the same direction in a line, and then they all started going in every direction at once. And just like in the movie. This usually meant either they had run into something or they're about to take a break. They go out in every direction to find a good spot to lay down for a few hours. We snuck up on the group and we had them. They all gathered around and we told them to follow us back to the Bronco. We did a quick head count. I came up with 21 guys and BT came up with the same number. We decided, what the heck, so we both took off at the front of the group. If they followed us, they followed us. We walked all the way back to our vehicle, never stopping for a recount. We hardly even looked back to see if they were following. Once we're back at our vehicle, we did another head count. We now had 23 people. Apparently, as we were walking along, 2 more aliens fell in with our group. We had to call for help transporting everyone. For unknown reasons, this only worked on the south side. Up north, it was always a huge mess when you encountered a large group. On SRT one night, I was working out west, and we had a group coming our way. Steve moved up the trail, and I stayed put. Once the group passed me, I would fall in behind them, and we'd catch them in the middle. As soon as Steve saw the group coming close, he turned on his light, and I turned on mine. Instead of sitting down like they do down south, the whole group turned and ran out through a cactus field in the dark. There was no trail. They simply ran over and through the cactus, blazing a trail and picking up thorns as they went. It didn't take those folks long to realize they'd screwed up. Over about the next 30 minutes or so, they came staggering out of the brush, begging for some relief from all the cactus thorns stuck everywhere. I picked out as many thorns as I could while we sat there waiting for the whole group. They were a miserable bunch once we had them loaded up and headed to town. For some odd reason, me and Steve had a few weird things happen while working together. He was allergic to mesquite pollen. It made the sclera of his eyes swell up. It looked weird since his eyes kind of bulged out, but the pupils would sink in. A bit of Benadryl took care of that problem. One night, we saw a group of 5 guys walking along the street near a railroad crossing. We drove up to them, and they readily admitted to crossing the river illegally. We took them to the North Station to process. One of the five had a bandana tied around his forehead. There was a little tiny bit of blood near his eyebrow. I asked if he was okay, and he said that he had tripped and hit his head, but he wanted to go back to Mexico. I asked him if he didn't want to see a doctor, and he said no, just want to go home. He swore he was okay. We wrapped up the paperwork, and we're about to take these guys to the bridge when one of the brand new supervisors walked over and asked what's up with the head bandage. As I was saying that the guy just wanted to go to Mexico, the supe grabbed the bandana and yanked it off. Not a good idea when you're dealing with a bandage, but, well, he was not a medic. It was a bit more than a little cut. The alien yelled and grabbed the wound. I could see his skull through the opening. Well, this just got interesting. As long as he hadn't wanted medical attention and I didn't see the wound, there was very little I could do about it. It was his call. A patient has the right to refuse treatment. Once I saw the head wound was a bit more, well, a lot more severe, I had to become the super medic, even if not asked, because the patient was in custody. It's one of those gray areas when it comes to treating people. We loaded him up and drove over to a clinic on Guadalupe Street. Steve was one of those skinny guys who were always hungry. We got to the clinic and I told him to go get something to eat while I stayed with the patient. We had to wait to see the doctor, like always, and Steve was back before we were ushered into the exam room. I got the alien up on the examining table. Well, I guess I should call him a patient now. And we sat and waited for the doctor. Steve went and sat in the corner as far from the patient as he could get. The doctor came in and looked at the wound. It was about 3 inches long, and like I said, you could see the skull through it. There was not as much bleeding as I would have expected. Head wounds are notorious for bleeding a lot. The doc told the nurse to give our boy something for the pain and to get the suture kit. Me, being a medic, I volunteered to hold the patient's head while the doctor sewed him up. The doctor stuck his finger in the hole, looking for any debris. I was watching the doc when I heard what sounded like a gag coming from the corner. Steve was turning green. He had been a ranger in the army, but blood made him queasy. Big open wounds made him downright sick. Well, the doctor started up, ready to sew up the wound, and Steve kept getting more nauseous. I finally told him maybe he should step outside, and that was all it took. He leaped to his feet, one hand pressed firmly over his mouth, trying to hold in his lunch, and he ran for the door as fast as he could go. The doc looked at me as if to ask, and I just pointed to the head wound, and I guess he understood what I meant. The doc started with the suturing. He stuck the needle through the little flap of skin and started to pull it through, and suddenly he dropped the forceps down onto the patient's face. That's kind of odd. I looked up at the doc. He's clutching his chest and making noises kind of like what Steve had just been doing before he left the room. The doctor's skin was gray. He was staggering away from the table, and he was running with sweat. I ran over and grabbed him. I was about to lay him down on the floor instead of letting him fall, when the alien jumped from the table and ran for the door. He wasn't trying to escape. He was afraid I might blame him for everybody in the room getting sick. The suture was hanging down his face, and it was pulling the flap down over one eye. Something out of a horror movie. I had the doctor under one arm and the alien under the other, trying to handle both at once and not doing either. The nurse came in, wanted to know what I was doing to the doctor. I told her, he's having a heart attack and I am about to start CPR. I managed to get the alien back up on the examining table and he laid there too afraid to move. The nurse ran for the defibrillator as I laid the doc out on the floor. He was breathing, gasping for breath. Two nurses came running with the defibrillator as the doc started to wave us all away. He kept gasping for air, and then he said, "It's just indigestion." Everybody who has a heart attack says it's just indigestion, just before they die. People who have heart attacks, they usually find either Rolaids or Tums in their pocket. They swear it's a heart attack right up until it takes them away. The doc was a bit blue in the face, but he started to look a little more normal. The alien looked like he was going to have a heart attack instead. He was trembling, too scared to move. The doc stumbled over the examining table, and he looked like he was having a hard time staying up. His hands were shaking, and so I told him if he would give me permission, I would sew the patient up. The doc thought about it for a few seconds, but he decided he'd better do it. He proceeded to make a horrendous mess of the stitch job. It looked more like a belly button than a wound. The patient was feeling much better once the drugs had kicked in and he'd gotten his head sewn back up. He wasn't going to get blamed for Steve or the doctor getting sick, so I guess he decided he was going to survive. Steve was waiting out at the vehicle. He was still a little bit green, and he asked if I would drive back to the station. He definitely was not interested in getting any more food that night. It's a good idea to try new things. One new thing was the bike patrol. This sounded like a neat way to catch folks who wouldn't be expecting an agent on a bike. A lot of agents put in for the bike patrol thinking it was an easy way to spend the day. When it's 105 degrees, you don't have an air conditioner. Your only means of transportation is what your body can do. The streets were rough and we wound up crashing a lot. Everybody who was on the border patrol, bike patrol, wound up losing some blood one way or another. The clever aliens would walk up a one-way street against the direction of traffic. This way they could see agents coming and duck into a store. On a bike, we could sneak up on them and surprise them before they knew what was happening. Our 8-man unit usually caught more people than the line units. This led to some supervisors telling their agents to not help us out with transport. Some of them were dicks. I caught a rather well-endowed female in the park one day. She had removed her clothing in order to cross the river and had put everything in a plastic bag. Well, the bag leaked, so everything she had was soaked anyway. As she stepped out of the bushes, I was standing there and I took her into custody. She had on a white t-shirt, tan spandex shorts, and high heels. What an outfit. None of the day shift answered when I called, so I started walking her to the bridge, which was only about a dozen blocks away. As I'm walking along, all the vehicles go by would slow down. Some would honk and wave at her. All this attention got her to swinging her hips a lot more to a ridiculous extent. Soon I noticed the same vehicles were going by several times. These guys were circling the block. Once at the bridge, I wished her Feliz Senderos, happy trails, and as she walked south into Mexico. That was when I noticed her spandex shorts matched her skin tone almost perfectly. It looked like all she had on was a t-shirt. No wonder those guys were all honking and waving. We were constantly being told by our supervisors not to leave our bikes unattended while near the river. Sometimes this just wasn't doable if you were in hot pursuit of somebody and they ran into the brush. We would bail off of our bikes and run into the brush after them, just leaving everything behind unattended. It was bound to happen eventually. One of our agents, let's call her Linda, just because. Linda had jumped off her bike and ran into the brush, chasing some aliens. She came walking out after a few minutes and didn't see her bike where she'd left it. She immediately thought that we were messing with her. She called us and said that we were being very funny, but it was time to bring her bike back. We all swore we didn't move her bike. It took some time for the realization to set in. Her bike had been stolen, and it was probably now back in Mexico. As she'd had some expensive sunglasses hanging from the handlebars, real expensive, like a few $100s. And she was like that. Oh, it got ugly. As she went from thinking we were just messing with her to it's now the end of the world. How could such a horrible thing happen to her? Now she was going to have to explain to the supervisor how she had lost her bike and why she had disregarded his orders. As we stood there wondering what horrible things might happen, the radio operator called and said there was some guy at the bridge with one of our bikes. It turns out a bridge security guard in Nuevo Laredo had seen a guy swimming to Mexico hauling the bike. He could see that it was one of ours, so he confiscated it, and then he returned it to the middle of the bridge. Linda was overcome with joy. She was still going to have to do a memo, but at least now she wasn't going to have to pay for the bike. What was really bizarre was her fancy sunglasses were still hanging from the handlebars. We told her she needed to take that security guard out to dinner, or at least buy him something nice. What are the odds she would not only get her bike back, but her glasses as well? We sometimes worked in pairs and sometimes on our own, depending on how we felt that day and how many agents were working. I was on my own one day and I was riding through San Agustin Plaza when one of the women at the Baird's Bakery outlet waved me over. She said there was some guy in the store making trouble, and they were afraid he might do something dangerous. She had stepped outside to call the police when she saw me, and she asked me to help. I went inside the store, and there he was. A young guy, maybe in his early 20s. Nothing on but a pair of blue jeans. He was running with sweat even though it was cold outside, and his eyes were dilated as big as they could get. His body was twitching. I very politely asked him to follow me outside, and as I was passing the woman at the cash register, I just mumbled under my breath to call the police, just in case they thought I had the situation under control. We got outside, and I asked the guy what his name was and where he was from, even though I already had figured out he was a U.S. citizen. As I was talking, the guy telegraphed his intentions. His hand went back and he made a fist. It was almost comical since the guy was so high he didn't know he was giving his intentions away. As he threw the punch, I just stepped in close and deflected the blow. He screamed and he tried to grab me. I pushed and he went down. Once on the ground, I flipped him over so he was facing down, and then I sat in the middle of his back so he couldn't go anywhere. This made him mad, so he tried to rear up, swinging his head back as hard and as fast as it would go. The whole equal and opposite thing made his face come down on the pavement, and I guess he broke his nose. All I was doing was sitting there, keeping him still, waiting for the police to arrive. You never try to handcuff anybody who's resisting like that. Then we had to get him on his feet and into the patrol car. It took 3 cops and me to get this guy up and into the back seat. He screamed and kicked, trying to bite anybody and everything that he could get close to. As the police were driving away, people came from several stores around the plaza saying they saw the whole thing and they would testify in court that he had tried to hit me first. They offered sworn statements if I needed them. This guy had been hanging out in a bunch of the stores, making life difficult for them, and they were thankful to see him being hauled away. I thanked everybody, and once I had all my information down, I rode over to a restaurant, a place called the Hot Dog Express. Don't know whatever happened to that place. I sat down with a cup of coffee and a notebook, and I started to write out what I was going to put in the memo. It has been said many times, never sign a memo and turn it in until somebody has read it. My supervisor looked it over and he said I had covered every question available. And nothing ever came back to me about the incident. The next day, as I was riding through the plaza, the women at the bakery outlet called me over. They offered me all kinds of goodies on the house. I had to pass, but I did buy a few fruit pies. My grandfather used to work at the Mrs. Baird's, and he would bring home old bread and pies all the time. I kind of grew up eating fruit pies from Mrs. Baird's. For several months, any time I was in San Agustin Plaza, the folks working there would come out and wave to me as I went by. It felt really weird. I did run into Mr. Cokehead about a half a year later. He was standing on a corner, and I rode up. I stopped in front of him, and he knew who I was. I asked if he was behaving, and he said, "Yes, sir." I looked him in the eye, and they both looked normal, so I figure, well, he is behaving himself, but I never saw him again after that day. Accidents were just a given on the bike patrol. If you rode a bike for a living, you were going to hit the ground. One day I was flying along a trail under bridge number 2. A group was crossing behind the import lot. I dropped down off the trail and I sped down a hill. My front tire chose that moment to suddenly turn sideways, even though the handlebars were still straight across. These bikes were kind of old and some of the parts were worn out. I had been going downhill at a high rate of speed. Now my front tire was working like a plow. The bike came to a stop and I was launched over the handlebars. I flew through the air, kind of slow motion, thinking, I need to do something and quick. I managed to twist myself around into a ball and I landed on my back. I made a human-shaped imprint in the dirt. I lay there thinking, well, that didn't hurt too much. Just as I was about to get up, I saw my bike was flying through the air, coming straight at me. I put my hands up in front of my face and the bike came down right on my stomach. It was like getting punched really hard. I was bruised for weeks. I was there under the bridge fixing my bike while the aliens ran out of the brush and right into the arms of a waiting team of agents in a van. Hitting the ground was a common thing. We were racing back to the bike shed one day. One of our guys was out front. He wanted to be the first one there, just for the bragging rights. We saw him disappear over a hill, and then a huge cloud of dust went up in the air. When we got to the top of the hill, there he was, laying on the ground, covered from head to toe with fine, powdery dirt. He looked like a human statue. Once at the shed, he had to take all of his gear apart and clean everything. There was dirt inside his pistol, all of his magazines, the battery compartment on his radio. He had dirt everywhere. Being a separate unit from the line, we got sent on some duties that nobody else wanted. Things like public relations and school functions. All the things that I hated. Somebody thought it would be a good idea to hold a huge concert for the kids in the schools of Laredo. Some of these schools hated each other. Fights would occur at just about any joint events. The weird thing is that people that graduated from one school would still not like people who graduated from one of the other schools. Kind of like they were indoctrinated or hypnotized or something. Well, they had a musical group coming. I used the name lightly. A group came to the Laredo Civic Center, and all the older kids were invited to come listen. The police, the sheriff's department, the constables, and the border patrol were all there as security. All the kids coming in were searched. No weapons, no pens, nothing that could be used during a fight. Everything was confiscated and thrown into a big box, including combs. We had female officers and agents there to check the girls. It took well over an hour to get them into the building and sat down. Each school was assigned a section of seats with several agents and officers in the aisles to make sure that nobody moved from their section. There were officers assigned to the bathrooms and the hallways. Everyone was told they would remain in their seats unless they had to go to the bathroom, in which case they had to be accompanied by a teacher. Being a senior agent, I managed to finagle my way into being assigned to one of the exits on this side of the stage. The music was not to my taste, but I managed to mostly ignore it. The singer would stand up there and tell all the kids, "On your feet," followed by all the agents and officers saying, "Sit down." I guess she didn't get the memo. The kids were to remain seated, period. The exit doors next to me had about a 1-inch gap in them. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Somebody was standing in the hallway on the other side of the doors. This was a fire exit, and nobody was supposed to be there. I waited until the person had moved just a bit to the left, and I pushed the right-hand door open fast. I used my SRT training as I went out the door. As I went, I spotted a gun in the guy's hand. He was dressed like your typical gangbanger. I pushed the guy up against the wall while closing the door with my foot. I couldn't possibly do any of these maneuvers now, but at the time I was in good shape. I had him pinned to the wall and his gun hand pinned to his side. I think he was having trouble breathing because he started to turn blue. Well, I did have him by the neck after all. He may have had to, or possibly did, go to the bathroom. There was a bit of a smell in the air. I really thought this guy was some goon there to cause trouble. I used to lift weights. One time I maxed out at 300-pound bench press. I had a good 50 pounds, and I was probably 6 inches taller than this guy. He sputtered and managed to say something that sounded like he was with the group. I looked in his eyes and kind of told me that he didn't really belong to any gang. He looked too wimpy. I released his neck, but I hung on to the gun. It was a revolver loaded with blanks. He said he was supposed to sneak up on stage and act like he was going to kill the singer to impress the kids into not joining gangs. Live action. Ugh. I asked him if he didn't think it would have been a good idea to let the guys with the real guns know they were going to do such a thing in the middle of the concert. He meekly agreed with me. I called my supervisor and I let him know what was going on, and he got with the folks in charge and told them what had almost happened to one of their performers. If he'd had that gun up as I came through the door, things might have gotten a lot messier. I wasn't loaded with blanks. The whole thing was quickly swept under the carpet. Nobody wanted to admit such a bad decision had been made in a building full of kids. I hope I didn't hurt his neck or the back of his head when I plowed him into that wall, and I hope his feelings are okay. Next time, let the folks with the real guns know what's going on. Maybe it'd be a better idea. On occasion, we had to work the airport. Aliens would be dropped off at the airport, and they'd buy a ticket to fly to somewhere away from the border. This was back when you didn't have to show your driver's license to buy a ticket. We would check everybody getting on the plane. And I really hated this job because we had to do it in our Class A uniforms. The old terminal had just one gate, yet they would announce passengers should move to gate number 1 to board their flights. There was no gate number 2. We had the security area where people had their baggage checked, and then they would have to pass us. One day, as we're standing there checking folks going by, the man running the x-ray machine kind of caught our eye. There was a .45 caliber pistol in this guy's jacket. We grabbed him and yanked him out of the line and got him over to the side and asked him why he was carrying a weapon. If he had been law enforcement, we'd already know about it. The guy just kind of sputtered and stammered, and finally he managed to tell us that he was with TSA. They were testing the security at the airport. We got the TSA supervisor and asked him if it wouldn't have been a good idea to send somebody through without telling us. The guy actually thought we would just stand there and not do anything. TSA stands for Thousands Standing Around. They wouldn't have done anything, but we tended to respond to threats a little quicker and a lot faster than them. Late one night, 1991 or 92, we received a phone call from the radio room. The radio operator said a couple of kids working as gate guards had heard some people or something walking around their trailer in the middle of the night. With oil rigs scattered all throughout Texas, a lot of ranchers don't want just anybody driving in and out of their property. So they would hire someone, or the oil field company would hire somebody to man the gate. You'd drive up to them, you'd fill out a piece of paper saying why you were going onto the ranch, and then they'd let you in. Then they had to make sure that you left the ranch without things in the back of your truck that didn't belong there. Well, these two kids had been hired as gate guards, and they were scared, thinking that there might be someone sneaking around their trailer. Smugglers did work that area, and some could be dangerous. So me and my partner drove out to see what was going on. The gate in question was up Wellhausen Road, which is north of Oilton. It connects Highway 359 with Highway 59. We drove up the dirt road until spotting a small trailer next to a gate that we figured was the one we wanted. As I stopped at the gate, I flipped on the overheads just for a second so the gate guards would know who we were. Somebody peeked out one of the windows. The door opened just enough for half of a face to appear. The kid yelled at us that there was something moving around in the brush around their trailer. A something, I asked? The kid said that it sounded huge and it was growling as it went. Him and his brother were both too scared to step outside. I looked at my partner and he looked at me, and we both thought, this is weird. I told the kid at the door we had to have a look. He immediately slammed the door shut. We both walked up and down the road, checking the side of the road for any footprints. The dirt was well churned up, and there was no sign of people crossing the road. We jumped the fence. I went over on the north side of the trailer, and my partner went on the south, and we worked our way around through the brush on opposite directions until we ran into each other. There was no sign of anything anywhere near the trailer or in the vicinity. We walked back to the door of the trailer, and we told the two kids that there was nothing there and they didn't really have anything to fear. As we were getting back in our unit, the trailer door swang open with a bang. Both kids came running out, jumped in an old pickup. They drove out the gate, not even bothering to stop and close it. I could see they were both white and shaking. I closed the gate and locked it as the truck took off down the road heading for town. We never saw those two again, and we never figured out what it was that had terrified them so much. The weird thing is, this was not the only time we had heard something like this. There was a guy that lived in Aguilares, who would come by the checkpoint on occasion and say that there was a werewolf walking around his property at night. As far as we know, this guy wasn't crazy, and he wasn't drunk, and he wasn't high. But he was constantly telling us that there was a huge, hair-covered creature skulking around his property late at night. Someone in Washington decided everybody working for the government had to receive training in case what is known as an active shooter took place. If someone were to start shooting at folks working in, say, the archives or the printing agency, they wanted people to know what to do and what not to do. None of our agents could pass the test. We were all saying that if we heard shooting, we would go towards the sound, engage the threat, take them out. That's an incorrect answer. What the people in Washington wanted us to do was to hide under a desk or in the closet. Yell, screaming and running away, going, "Run away, run away," like that scene from the Holy Grail. I finally told all the guys to answer the questions as if they were all a bunch of little kids in school. It took some doing, but we managed to get at least a 70 or so. So much of our training was geared towards people who didn't carry guns or know how to fight. The government just can't get it through their heads that one size does not fit all. People who read a book on how to do things should never be allowed to train folks who've been there and done that. Towards the end of my career, I trained a bunch of agents on how to teach CPR and first aid classes. I was an instructor trainer. And then I went back to my shift. A few weeks went by, and I was asked if I would be willing to go to training and teach the actual classes. The guys I had trained knew how to teach a basic class. The trouble we were encountering was the students would have questions that the instructors couldn't answer. Things like if you're doing CPR and you notice the patient is bleeding, what should you address first? The guy in charge, who just happened to be a friend of mine, said he was not only able to answer these said that I was not only able to answer these questions, but I also had experience that the instructors didn't have. This gave me some kind of a standing as far as the students were concerned. So I spent most of my last year teaching agents how to handle medical emergencies until the medics arrived. Just about every Border Patrol agent knew who I was, so once I retired, I was constantly running into people who knew me, even though I was at a loss as to who they were. The old patrol has come and gone, and the newer, kinder patrol is wasting their time babysitting aliens and not securing the border. If I were to join today, I'd probably last about a month before I went looking for something else to do, or more than likely, I would be encouraged to go somewhere else. It was a fun and somewhat rewarding job back then. Today, not so much. I know things change, but they're getting worse, not different. If you enjoyed the show, tell your friends and neighbors to listen up as well. If you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at strangethings@arkanasa.com. And if you'd like to buy a t-shirt, you can find my products at tpublic.com. There's t-shirts and bags and all kinds of cool little gifts for people you don't know what to buy them for their birthday. And hey, why wait till the last possible second? You could start your Christmas shopping right now. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.